Okay. Great.
Oh, really? Was it from Vermont now?
Yeah. So
they
called me. Yeah, they called me when I was getting on my plane.
Great.
Like, hey, do you want it? And I was like, yeah, I'm getting on a plane. Can you put it aside for me? And they were like, okay.
They literally made deposits on their .com.
And I went and they became like maximum stock. I was like, okay.
They were like way overestimating that shit.
Hey everybody, welcome back. Glad to see everybody here. So last class, we talked a little bit about scripting the DOM and like what that means when we say the DOM. We're gonna talk a little bit more about the DOM today, but we're gonna go over a little bit more on scripting because we added a little bit of content to the scripting lesson to better explain a couple of things. Also, I felt like we were rushing a little bit at the end of scripting, so I want to like cover particularly like what callback functions are for events again, and talk about how when you trigger an event, like clicking on an element that has a listener, and even not a listener, I'll explain that in a minute, how the event can get passed to the event handler as an argument, which is common. It's really common to do. And this is sort of like the guts of how you make pages become more interactive, so that when you click on things, there are certain procedures or functions that happen inside your code that you are planning on the page actually like changing or listening for input or something and then like responding to it. So I just wanted to check in on how we were doing from the projects that we have on deck so far, right? We already have the Tic-Tac-Toe project and the Zorkington project, and if you haven't started those, that's fine. And if you missed a class or two and you need to get caught up with me, I can talk to you about those and also talk to you about approaches to those projects. Furthermore, if you missed some classes because people were sick, it seems like a flu's been going around or something. So if you caught that flu and you weren't here, we are streaming these lessons live. So we're streaming live now, and I post all of them to the Burlington Code Academy live stream playlist. So you can go in there and watch the playlist. I try to name them appropriately so that you know like which live stream is associated with which class and that sort of thing. I'm going to be trying to do more videos as well, but for now we do live streams and I try to do supplementary videos in addition. So like probably the next supplementary video I'm going to do is sort of a slow walkthrough on how to do the Visual Studio Code debugger like step by step, since people seem to be asking about it, and it's really best explained with a video rather than, I could tell you to read the documentation, but I don't think that it's going to be as helpful, essentially. So we left off on Tuesday night talking about events. And you may not know it, but as you interact with your web page, like all the time, like as I am going through and mousing over various sections of my web content, different events are actually getting fired all the time. It's just that there's nothing listening for those events. So when I like click on content, like up here, events are fired, events are fired. If I move my cursor in and out of sections of the page, events are fired. If I type letters, events are fired. You notice that this one has like a go to slide, right? There's actually an event that was listening for that. That has to do with the slide software that we use. So I'm gonna say go. But as I type letters in my browser on my keyboard, I'm actually firing events as I do that. It's just that my web page right now doesn't have a listener other than this Go. So if I type G, this Go panel shows up. And this Go panel won't show up if you are not in slide mode. It only is enabled when we're in slide mode because we assume that somebody actually wants to have the ability to jump to a certain slide if they desire, right? So the point is that we set up an event listener for that kind of jumping modal, okay? And if I were to type G and then say 11 and hit enter, well, it'll move me to slide 11. That was a user interface interactive element that we designed. And you can design stuff like that too if you want to. I'm gonna move forward one slide now. So the point is that your event listeners are really like the catcher in some baseball game. Like the catcher can be there and they can catch the ball, but the pitcher is still gonna throw the ball, right? Every time that the batter comes up to plate. So the catcher can be there and receive the event that comes down the pipe from the browser. But if you don't set one up, the event's still gonna fire. So we call those catchers, we call those event handlers. They are functions that are there listening, and when an event occurs, then they end up getting that event. So if we had a click listener that we add to a button, and we define it in line like this, then when we click on some button on the page, then we have this alert come up that says abracadabra. And I think on the next page, let me see, it might be one back. I'm trying to find where the slide is. It's like 3 or 4 slides forward. Where's the magic button? It's further back here. Hold on. Yeah, here it is. So this is a event handler for this button named Magic. We added this alert handler to it. So when we click on this button in the page, we get an alert that pops up that says abracadabra, and then we can close the alert by clicking OK. And so when we jump over to slide 12, if I do this now, we can add an event listener using this style, which is that we have to target the button using the DOM query methods that we talked about on Tuesday. Remember, we're using getElementById, and that function lives on the document object that's always present on your web page. The document is global and it's always there whether or not you use it. You don't have to define it. It comes with the browser by default. And we can pass it the name of the ID we want to target. It targets it, so now we can assign that result to this button variable. And with that button variable, we can then call this method add event listener on it, and we pass in the string click because we want to listen for those string events. And the second argument to add event listener is either a reference to a function, if we had some function that does this alert for us, or it's the definition of the function that we want to fire. All right, and they're very close. They're very similar in how they behave. There are some minor differences. We can try to cover those as they pop up. But so long as you're not doing anything like passing objects and using this inside of a function, then they should behave the same. There's a little bit of weirdness when you start passing this around. We can talk about that later if we encounter that, okay? But for most of what you need to do, you don't need to do anything like that. So this is sort of just a recap of what we have already covered. Does everybody remember this from Tuesday? Are there like big gaping questions here from people about how to use these things or how they work that I can try to clear up for us while we're kind of remembering what we covered at the end of class on Tuesday? Not seeing hands yet, so maybe people are thinking about it. If not, that's cool. I just wanted to check in and remind us where we left off, right? Because when you're dealing with web pages and adding functionality, well, adding like behavior to them, one of the primary ways that you do this is using these types of DOM element targeting and event listener creation, all right? So we create event listeners, which are functions, and we target DOM elements, and we add the event listener to those DOM elements like this. This is the best way to do it. You can do it in the HTML, but I don't recommend it. Like what we had on slide 4, where we had that abracadabra. Let's see if I can go to, I think it was on 3 or 4. Here, this is in the HTML, right? So like, this is as though you wrote this HTML in your web page, and you're just defining what kind of behavior you want right in the HTML. This is okay for like quick and dirty stuff, like if you want to prove that something works. But if you're building a web application, this gets messy really fast, and so that's why I don't recommend it. Riley, you had a question?
Yeah, can you go back to, was it 11 or 12 you were on?
I think I was on 11 or, let me see what we got here. Over here? No, next one.
Yeah, so I'm used to, yeah, exactly.
Right here.
I'm used to seeing notation like this
Mhm.
In Google Analytics.
Yep.
And I want to make sure I'm understanding it right. So that on bullet point 2 there, you're referencing the variable, and then add event listener is a method that you're performing, and then usually when I see those parentheses and something inside them, it's
right here.
a parameter that you're passing to a function. Yeah, so click in itself, is that like a built-in, like what is that? Where does that come from? It's a string.
Yeah. Why do we have to pass a string?
Is it automatically defined as mouse click? Is that?
So essentially, yes. What it is that when you're adding this event listener, what happens is that you pass this string over to add event listener as an argument. And then what add event listener does is it binds this function as the property of the whatever the on and then the name of the string is. So in the button, we had an on-click property. On another element, maybe you want to have a listener for hovering over the element with your mouse. You want to change the color from no color to yellow when you hover over it. So in that case, your add event listener here wouldn't be click, it would be hover, so that you're listening for the on hover event. And there are other events too that you can add.
But click and on hover, are those system defined?
On click and on hover are both defined by the browser. Okay. Yeah, they're standardized events.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and I'll show you where you can look up all those events so that you can know what event does this thing listen for. There's going to be a lot, but there's only a few events that are used very often. All right, so like on focus is when like you're tabbing through a web page and you see the little highlighted border around different elements. That's common. On click is very common. On hover is very common. And then there's other ones like on enter and on exit, which is essentially like when you move your mouse inside of another element and move it out of that element. So for example, you might have an element that's inside of another one, so it's contained within a second element, and you want to do something when you've gone not just hovering over an element, but you're actually contained within another based on where the mouse pointer is on the web page.
So when we see like exit intent pop-ups, they're saying on exit of the DOM as a whole, or do you know what I mean by exit intent?
I don't know what you mean by exit intent.
You go to X out of a tab, especially common in e-commerce.
Oh, okay,
it pops something up and says, wait,
yeah.
don't leave. Here's
Yeah.
10% off.
Right. So
they're
that's
using a
they're
dot
using
next
that
to
you're
it.
using an event handler there.
Okay. And
Yeah.
then would they be
Might be on.
Would they be watching the whole DOM, the whole window, or like how do they know when you're hovering out towards the
There's probably a
X button?
specific event for closing a tab, and I would have to look up what exactly that event name is, but it's probably something like on close.
Okay.
Yeah, and I can find that out for you if you'd like. Yeah, Missy.
On the note at the bottom of that slide, it's basically saying that if you were to use
This or this one?
that, the yellow part,
Yeah. Okay.
if you were to use the keyword this,
Yeah.
in that callback function,
Yeah.
that it wouldn't mess up anything as soon as you got out of creating that event listener, because you don't use the this variable inside of that event listener, so I was wondering.
If we were to use a this within the function that's defined here, this gets kind of complicated. So let me try to break it down. When you create an event listener, and you use this within the event listener, if your event listener is a regular function that does not use the fat arrow, what that means is that your function gets detached from its context, from where it's defined, and when it gets called, it doesn't have a this value, and so that this becomes the window object, which is almost never what people want when they use a callback function. It's a well-known flaw in JavaScript and in using functions for callbacks. There's a bunch of different ways to solve that, but the best way that you can use today is to use the fat arrow, because what the fat arrow does is that fat arrow changes where the this is pointing to, the special variable this. And instead of pointing to the function itself or the object itself, it points to the context within which the function is being called. So that's why using a fat arrow for callbacks is almost always what you want to do when you define them, where you pass them. Okay? So if you encounter this problem, then what you can do is you can call myself over, or Bob over, or Alex over, or whoever is near you, and we can explain to you why the pointer isn't working for your particular situation, because there's sort of like a myriad of different scenarios that can cause that problem, and it's easiest to actually debug them at the point when they occur, rather than trying to explain every single way that these things can kind of get confusing. But I can point you to specific documentation on MDN that talks about why using fat arrow for callbacks in an event handler is a really good idea. And they give you specific examples of that, which I think would be more helpful than me just talking about them. I can look that up during the break if you'd like. Cool. So any other questions about these before we go to the new slides? The new slides are like the next slide or two. Does anybody else have questions about how event handlers work so far? There's a definition for add event listener down here on the MDN. I'm just going to open that up really fast because this is a helpful page. So for adding event listeners, so the add event listener sets up a function that will be called whenever the specified event is delivered to the target. This is like when you trigger events, the event will get sent to this node and will be handled by this function. So let's just come down here really quick. There are a few different ways that you can, with a few different properties on the event that are important. One is that events have a type, but you seldom have to check the type, because when you set up your event listener, you probably want to have it listen for a specific type of event, like a click or a hover or so forth. And so you are essentially filtering for that type right away. Okay. This is showing how to set up a global event listener. Okay. And there's another function that you can use to remove event listeners as well, which I'll try to talk about in a slide or two. They go into some really good detail here. So for example, this is how you would set up on a simple table a function to be able to listen for clicking inside the table, and they pass this modified text function, which is the event handler, as the listener for a click event on this element, and that element is whatever element has the ID outside, which is the outer table. It's the outer table. So let's see the example that they're showing here. So here's our table down in here, and when we click on here, we change from 1 to 2 or to 3. Does everybody see that? I'm clicking on it and it's switching the content of the second row from 2 to 3. So what this has done is that when I click, let me move up so you can see the whole content. When I click inside this table with an ID of outside, which is targeted by using document.getElementById outside, we've set up an event listener called modify text that sets up another target, which is the ID T2, which is this data right here. And it changes it from 2, if the value is 2, to 3, or from 3 to 2. So if the first child's value is 3, change it to 2. Otherwise, change it to 3. So this is just what we did on our slides. It's just more detail about how this event listener works and how this add event listener function works. So let's go back to our slides and see if we gather any questions when we look at the next one or two. Okay. So this is exactly what, not exactly, it's the same class of solution that the Mozilla Developer Network gave as an example on the prior page. What we're doing here is we have a button with an ID of magic, and then we have some function called sayMagicWord that creates an alert. Remember, alert is that box that pops up inside of our browser with the OK button to close it. And that alert is going to say Shazam. What we do is we target that button by saying document.getElementById magic, and we assign that element, which is this element here, to the variable button. And then we add an event listener, which is of the class of click, and we pass a reference to the sayMagicWord function, which we've defined right up here, which will go ahead and give us that alert. I'll remind us with the code that we wrote on Tuesday when we switched the content of like a text content from like nothing to we need a bigger boat, or I can't do that, Dave, right? Or I'm sorry, Dave, I can't do that. So in our web page, when we load this up, this would trigger up an alert for us. And maybe I'll create a little web page to demonstrate that in a second. But we saw the same thing when we went back to slide 3 or 4 and clicked on the magic button on that page. All right. So remember, if you're going to pass that event listener using a reference, which is this is a reference to the event listener, you need to just pass the name. You don't want to open and close parentheses right here. And I'll actually put that in a web page and show you what happens when you do that so that you can identify that bug. It's fun, and it's very confusing when you've never seen it before because you're like, why is all this JavaScript firing? I haven't done anything. And I'll show you what happens. Okay. So if you open and close the parentheses after this function, what you're doing is you're calling it when you define the event listener. And the say the magic word doesn't return as a function to use. It actually calls alert, and then alert comes up on the page. So I'll show you right now how that's going to work, or how that would work. Let me copy this stuff into a web page really fast. So let me grab this, and I'll go into Visual Studio Code again. Let me pop this up, and we're going to jump over to Code Live as soon as my browser is done. Great. And inside of here, let me see what I have. Oh, I have DOM scripting. Let me cd into DOM scripting and see what I have there. All right, great. So I have an index.html. Let me edit that. So if let me see what I can do here. This is, you know what, let me do alert.html. So let's do code inside of here. And we'll open this up. And let me add this file really quick. So I'll call this alert.html. And inside of here, I will paste, hold on, let's see if we can do this. Yeah, there we go. So I have our button, and we have a script tag, which has our event listener. Now I need to go ahead and indent this in a little bit to make it more readable. So it's a little more readable now. Let me serve this so I can show you what happens when you have the parentheses at the end versus not having them at the end. Right now it looks pretty good. Let me format this and run it. That's not right. See if I can, I hit the wrong button. If I click this one, it'll actually start the server. Cool, so this is my alert.html. And if I click magic here, I see my alert, right? See my alert, all good, cool. So now let's do this really quick. Let's have another button to actually show you what would be wrong here. So if we have, this one would be, let's say, don't do this. And then we will grab the second button. We'll call this the, just call this bad button. And this one would be don't do this. And now I will come up here and change this over to don't do this. Inside of here, what we're going to do is we're going to add an event listener to bad button. And instead of passing say the magic word as a reference, we're going to pass it calling it in line. And now every time I load this file, it immediately, I'm hitting refresh, just to prove it to you, I'm hitting refresh, it immediately calls the event handler. It doesn't wait for the event to occur, it calls it right away, which is not what we want. So if I take those two parentheses off the end and I refresh, I took too many, thank you. If I refresh, now I can call it correctly. So if you end up having your code fire before you expect it to, remind yourself that you do not want to have the parentheses at the end. Ira.
Just out of curiosity, after it fires inappropriately, would it still fire appropriately if you push the button?
So that's a good question. Let's try it. So we have our inappropriate call here, right? Refresh. Let me refresh the page one more time. It fires. Okay. Now I'll click on it and nothing happens.
Oh no.
So why is that? Why is it that nothing happens the next time that we do it? Where over here it works. Here it works. I can click the button and then have this happen multiple times.
Well, you said it's passing the thing as a string to something else, so it's passing the whole thing as a string, and then it tries to call function.
Yeah, when we call it on line 21, what does it actually pass to the event listener when we call it? What does it actually pass to the event listener when we call it?
Whatever that
function.
word returns.
I heard two different things. I heard the function and I heard whatever the thing returns.
Isn't that what it does?
One of them is right. One of those things is right.
So it's calling the actual function instead of the elements or whatever of the function itself.
That's right. It's passing the return value of the function. And the return value of the function is the return value of alert. So it's passing the return value of alert being called. If we return something here like the number 1, it would pass the number 1 to as an event listener for this click. And that wouldn't work because the number 1 is not an event handler. It wouldn't know what to do. It also wouldn't error, but it wouldn't do anything. The web page will still work. You might get a line in your console.log telling you that something can't accept an argument or something like that, but your page will still load and still show because it's really hard to get a web page to not load when you have JavaScript errors in your page. Okay. So this one will actually pass the function to be called, and this one will pass the function after it'll pass the return value of the function after it's been called. Sorry, I wanted to get my words straight there. All right. It's a very common point of confusion, so that's why I'm really hammering this one a few times. All right. Let's take a look at the next couple slides. All right. So the next couple slides here. Let me close this one down. And we don't need that yet. So let's come back into here. Don't need that yet either. So let's see if I can make this a little bigger. I should do it. Man, it's so loud. Okay, so now the police are gone. So event parameters, okay? Here's what's going on. Look at one bigger. That's a little easier to read. So event handler functions, right? Most functions accept an argument most of the time. You're not just like creating an alert. You actually need to like take in some data and then process it in some way and then do something. Either have an effect or return a value. That's what you do with functions usually. Okay. Now functions, of course, could call other functions. That's possible. You could do that too. But sometimes it's easier to have the function just accept some data and do something rather than like delegating off to a bunch of other functions. So what we have here is that we have a function, say magic word, that accepts a parameter. All right, it accepts, this is an argument, I should say, and then it's a parameter inside the function. So it accepts an argument, and now it's inside here, now it's the parameter inside the function. And what you can do is you can name this whatever you want. You could call it event or E or, you know, the data from the event, whatever you choose to call it. You can then reference it by that name inside the function, all right? And the event, this is an event object from the browser. What happens is when an event is triggered, it's not just a string. There's actually a whole object that goes along with the event itself. And the event gets passed as an argument to a function. Whether or not you define an argument gets passed to that function. It gets passed as the first argument, and that is the event that was triggered by whatever it is you did in your web page. So if you clicked, it's going to be an on-click event. If you hovered, it's an on-hover event, because you've created an event listener for that particular kind of object. All right. There's some very common properties that you're going to want to get off of this event. One of the most common ones is what's called the event.target. So the target of the event is the node, and usually element, in the page that was the triggerer of the event. So if you clicked on a button, the node that is the event target is the button that you clicked. Okay? So why would that be important? Like, why would you want to do that? Well, if you had a form on your page and you had a button in the form that submitted the form, but you wanted to like validate, for example, that the phone number or the email address or the name that was put in met some criteria, right? You could actually read the contents of the form before you submitted it, and if it didn't meet that criteria, you could put something on the page to let the user know that the form isn't correct, that like they don't have enough numbers in their phone number, or that their email address doesn't look like an email address, or that you need to have 2 words for a name because it's supposed to be a first and a last, and it's not just first name, right? So you can do a lot of things with the target of the event that was actually fired. It's really useful. We're going to talk about some of those here. So if we had a button with this ID Presto, another button with this ID Abra, right? And then we target each one of those using a getElementById for Presto and Abra. Well, if we had this same magic word that accepts an event, we can then have some logic in here, right? So if the target equals the Presto button, all right, which is this one that we've already looked at on the page, then we could go ahead and say change-o. If the target is the Abra button, then we could say Kadabra. Otherwise, we could say Shazam. Okay? We can do something like this where we target it ahead of time, or the other way we could do this is that we could get different bits about the target itself. We could say target.innerHTML or target.text content to actually check to see what's inside of this button. If the button is Presto, then for the actual text of the button, then do this. If it's Abra, then do this. So you can target it and then match, or you can just look at things about the target and have there be different behavior that acts on that target based on whatever that data is. Both of those are very good ways to go. All right? Does that make sense? We now went from an event handler that just took action to an event handler that can actually take different actions and accept data from the thing that triggered the event. So this allows us to have a lot of power over how we behave based on what it is that was the triggering factor of the behavior. Imagine if you had an event that allowed you to listen for keystrokes. So you had a key down event in your page, and then every time you typed a keystroke, it printed the keystroke to some content in your HTML. And then you could just type, and no matter where you're typing in the page, it's just going to show up in some like text area inside of your web page. You can do stuff like that by being able to grab the target's key press data and actually like then redirect that key press data somewhere else in your page if you wanted to. All right. I'm prefacing that one because it's a sort of an extra credit challenge as part of the project for the Markdown project we're going to be tackling this weekend. All right, so I'll try to show you some examples of how that would work. Okay? So that is, I think, the last slide of this lesson. It is. Yes, Riley.
In this function,
yep.
You have event.target, and event is the parameter being pushed into the function.
Yeah.
Correct? the function is not called until the bottom of this script where it's pressed, yeah?
This isn't calling it. Remember, this is setting up the listener.
Okay.
Remember, these aren't calling the same magic word. This is setting up a listener so that when the triggering event of a click occurs, say magic word will get called. And say magic word then gets called with whatever target triggered that. So why don't I put this in some HTML and we'll see this work, okay? And I'll show you how this flies. So we have some buttons and some clicks. Ari, did you have a question?
Just a small one.
Yep.
Bob answered it.
Okay, great. So let's grab these, go into here. I'm going to create another file. We'll call this magic.html. And now we will put in some code here. Nope, that's not what I want to do at all. There it is.
How do you join that?
Yeah. How do I do that? It's a great question. There's a few different ways to do this. There are what are called snippets inside of Visual Studio Code that come out of the box. I didn't add these. They're not an extension that I added. But if I were to type HTML and then page down with the up or down arrow keys, you'll note that to the right there are some abbreviations that change. Okay? And if I come down to this one and I hit tab, so tab on my keyboard,
Yeah.
it fills in the content for me, and then it puts my cursor on line 6 where it says title, page title. And if I change this, if I just start typing right now, magic,
Right.
you note that it's a slightly different shade than the other two. And if I hit tab, it starts switching down to this spot on line 8, which is, it's hard to see it's on line 8 because of the wrapping, but it's actually on line 8. And if I hit tab again, it goes to the next spot in the snippet. And if I hit tab again, it goes to line 12. So I always forget what I'm supposed to put inside of the head of an HTML page for modern mobile browsers. And this is the line that you typically want to include for a modern mobile browser. And so I don't try to remember anymore. I just allow my editor to fill it in for me. And this is a quick way to do that. So just to cover it one more time, I type HTML, I scroll down to this HTML, I hit tab, and now I can tab through them, and I come inside the body, and now I can paste the rest of this content and format it so it looks decent. And now we have ourselves a little web page. Bob, you had a question?
It's not a question. I'm pretty sure that if you just do bang tab, that will do the same thing without having to.
So let's try it. So if I do exclamation point, which is the shorthand for bang, yeah, you're right. Mine was down here on these bang, bang, bang. But if I just go to the single exclamation point, it also wants to fill it in as well.
Do you have to define it as an HTML document first?
It has to be an HTML file.
Okay,
And
that's
so,
what I meant.
yep.
Yeah.
So if I end it with this HTML in the name of the file up here,
Then,
Visual Studio Code will recognize it as HTML. So that will do that for you. Bob, thanks for the reminder.
So that one you're missing your references to your external sheet.
I am.
for CSS and
I am. It doesn't actually matter though. I can just take them out.
Yeah. When is it appropriate to use JavaScript inline versus attaching a sheet?
If I am doing more than like 10 lines of JavaScript, I usually put it in its own file. It's a personal preference. When it seems more complicated than I want to maintain, I start putting things in their own files. And I'm going to talk about how you can include your own JavaScript, which we just saw, and how you can include other people's JavaScript as well later on in this lesson today. Okay? So let me go ahead and let me show you how this will work, and then I'll pull this into its own file as well so that we can all see how that works as well, okay? So I have magic here. This is inside of the script. This is all the JavaScript. I'm sorry, it doesn't highlight very well. I don't know what's going on with my, this is supposed to be, can you actually see what I'm highlighting or not here? You can't really, can you? I'll try to find a better coloration so that it's more obvious to you what I'm highlighting inside of the class, okay? I'll do that during the break today. But I highlight lines a lot in order to show what I'm trying to demonstrate. And if it doesn't make sense to you, it's because on my screen it's super obvious what's highlighted, and on yours it's on this contrast ratio of this projector, it's just not as obvious. So between these scripts right here is all of our code, okay? And I'll run this and show you what this looks like. So if I come over to here, is it on the other one? No, hold on. It's localhost 8888. No, 8888. And then I want to go to magic.html. Oh, wait a minute. Oh, it's 5555, sorry. Thank you. So I have two buttons, Presto and Abra. And if I click Presto, it says Changeo. And if I click Abra, it says Cadabra. But that's not very helpful. Let me open up the console here. And now I will come back into our code. And I'll do a couple more things. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say console.log event. And then I'm going to say console.log events.target. And I'm going to do this in a couple different ways. This one I'm just going to wrap up in a couple of curly braces to make the logging a little easier. And this one I'm going to also wrap up in curly braces, but I have to do a special thing where I'm going to say target is equal to event.target. This will make the logging a little clearer. That's the only reason I'm putting these two things in, is to make the logging in the console much clearer. So let's actually do this. I refresh. I click Presto. Oh, it says Changeo. But now I have two logs, and look at how they're printed. This is kind of nice. So I have one that says event mouse events, and I have one that says target button Presto. Does everybody see that? This is sort of like showing me what it is that actually gets passed into the function. So I have this mouse event, and this mouse event has some properties on it. Has a lot of properties, right? So one of these properties is the target, which is button Presto. Does everybody see that? And when I highlight over it, it highlights it in the page. And it's the same thing as when I come down here and highlight over button Presto down here. Same thing. It's the same one. So it just kind of makes the logging a little simpler. Note that the type of this event up here, is click. It's a click event. And it was the onClick event handler that actually listened for this. Now, if I investigate this Presto click button over here, I can look inside of my browser's elements window, which is showing me all the same things that, I'm sorry, this one is the hot reloading for this this live browser, but this is my, I'm wrong. Which is the one? It's this one. I'm sorry, I opened the wrong one. So this is showing me all the stuff that makes up this web page, right? Here's that headline that I always forget. Here's my button, both of the buttons on the page. And here is the actual code that fires when I click on one of those buttons. So let's see if there's any listeners on this event. So if I click on this button here, there's a few things that I can do. after I've clicked on the button, I can come down here and scroll this up a little bit. And I can click on this special tab in my console. It says Event Listeners. And you note that there's only one, and that event listener is click, and it's on button presto, because that's the one I've selected up here inside of my console right now, okay? So if I click on this one, the click handler has changed. The click handler has changed to button abra as the listener. And the other thing is that it tells me about this event handler in the console. It tells me that it's not going to only listen one time, and it shows me the handler as well. It says that the handler is say magic word, and if I hover over it, it shows me the code. That's the handler. So when you're adding handlers to a DOM element, there's a few things that you need to be able to determine for yourself. Did you add it to the right one? Did you add an event handler and then maybe remove it later in your code by accident? That's possible. If you did, this handler wouldn't be here. There would be no event handler on this button, which is the abra button up here, okay? And did you add the right function? Maybe you misspelled the function name, or maybe you accidentally called the function instead of passing just the function name. And if you did, you could hover over it and see what it is that's the value of the handler. Maybe the handler isn't what you think it is. Maybe it's undefined instead of being an actual function. So these are just a couple of tricks that you can use in order to debug event handlers as they come up in your code, okay? It is easy to kind of get sideways with event handlers and then not be able to figure out what went wrong. It's like a very common path that people can go down, where they maybe add more than one event handler by accident, and then they're triggering event handler, but it's not the one they think it is. Or again, maybe they've added an event handler and then they accidentally remove it later. So just keep in mind that it can be some tools that can help you out. And one of those tools is to use the console to inspect this kind of stuff. This console here, this is only about, I think this came out in like 2010, 2011 on Google Chrome. So before that, it was only available on Firefox, and it was called Firebug. It was a special extension that was built by Firefox, or Mozilla, I should say, for the Firefox browser. And before that, there were no debugging facilities at all. And in order to debug your JavaScript code or your event handlers, you had to resort to doing really weird stuff, like alerting, or having your debug code get written to a special part of your web page that you could read. And that was like really challenging. So all I'm saying is that these tools are pretty good. If you get kind of off the golden path a little bit, use them. They're really helpful, okay? There's another one that I'll show you after the break where we can debug things live in the browser too. There's ways that you can, the browser has a debug program similar to the way that Visual Studio Code has a debug program, and I'll try to show you that after the break, okay? All right, because I think if I show it to you now, I'm going to take you right to 8 o'clock, and I want us to break at like 7:45 so that we can come back at 8 and have a little bit more time tonight to talk about the project. Connor, you had a question?
Yeah, could you bring a little clarity to the difference where the first time you used say magic word, you didn't have the event argument?
Yeah.
And then the next time you added it, and what the difference would be?
Sure. Let me show you, let me change the code. How about that? So, say magic word, let's just make it not take an event now. No argument. It's not going to take one. However, let's do one more thing, which is that, let me console these two out. And now inside of here, I'm going to do something called console.log arguments. This is a special, it's a special keyword, okay? And I'll show you what I mean by that in a moment. It's kind of like this. It's a special word. It's defined inside of JavaScript. I don't have to define it myself. So let's log out arguments when we click on things. We still have, everything else is the same. We still set up the event listeners. We still set up the actual button targets up here. Okay? So let's run this again. Let's refresh. Now let's go over to the console and clear it. And press presto. Change-o. Oh, wait, what's this thing? Arguments. That's weird. Its length is 1. So it has something in here. It has something in the arguments. So if it has something in there, then I could get something out. What is the element that's in there? Well, it's this element. It's this thing. It's not an element. It's a mouse event. Well, the mouse event is the same as the target we had, the event that we had before. And that event has a target, which is right down here, which is the button presto again. So what that means, all right, the reason why I'm bringing this up is that whether or not your function that handles your event, whether or not your event handler defines an event as its argument, it still gets passed the event as an argument. And this has to do with the sort of flexibility of JavaScript functions. JavaScript functions, whether or not they define an argument, can always be passed an argument, which is very weird. I don't know any other language that allows you to do that. I'm not saying that they don't exist, I just don't know what they are. And so SayMagicWord, by the nature of it being a JavaScript function, can accept any arguments that we want. And I'll just try to show you that really quick. So I'll create another function really fast. I'll call that function flexible. And it doesn't take any arguments at all. But it does console.log out its arguments. Doesn't take any arguments. I have to spell it correctly. It does console.log that out. And it says console.log done with flexible. So that means now that inside of my code here, I could call flexible. Okay, I could say flexible just by itself. I could say flexible with A and then B and then C. That's fine. Or I could call flexible with 1 and then 2 and 1 and then 2 and then 3. That's fine too. Now, flexible doesn't do anything with those arguments other than log them, but it still gets them. So let's see what happens when I run this. I come in, let me clear this screen, and I will refresh. So flexible, get with flexible, gets called 3 times, 1 and 2 and 3. And you note that arguments here, the first time, its length is 0. It has no arguments. And that makes sense, because the first time I called it, I didn't pass anything. There's no arguments to get passed to flexible. But then the second time I call it, I pass it with with A and B and C. And we have argument 0 and argument 1 and argument 2. They get passed right along here. And then, so I have a length of 3 on the arguments. And then the last time, I call it with 1, 2, and 3. And again, the length is 3, but I have different arguments now. All right? So even though you define a function that doesn't accept any arguments in JavaScript, anything that calls that function is free to pass as many arguments as it wants. And JavaScript will just discard any of those arguments if the function doesn't use them. Okay? This also works if flexible were to take only one argument. That would be fine. The other ones would still come in to the function, and they would all of the arguments would all be in the arguments array. It's a very weird system, but it does allow for kind of extreme flexibility with how functions work in JavaScript. It allows you to not be concerned that if you pass one too many arguments to a function that you might raise an error. It was designed to work this way, even though it feels like it's a giant mistake. Okay? Does that make it any more sensible to anybody? Or is everybody more confused than when we started? Sue, you look like you have a question.
I have a question. So let's say you create a function and it's expecting 3 arguments.
Yep.
But you only want to give it 1.
Yeah.
And it's the 3rd one, or it's the middle one.
Uh-huh.
How do you, because when I was working before, I'm like, okay,
If I write my own function that accepts 3 arguments, I will want all 3 of those arguments to be passed every time. Otherwise, if I don't pass them, then what happens is that I would have to pass in undefined for argument 1 and 3, or I wouldn't be able to pass in number 2. Because if I pass just one argument, it's going to come in as argument 1.
And you could pass in something that really, at the time, you don't need.
Yeah.
Possibly.
So I'm going to expand on this in a later lesson,
Yeah.
but there are ways to be able to pass what are called named arguments to functions in JavaScript, and with things like default values. So you could have let me show you what I mean. So you could have I'm just going to do this very quick. This is an ad hoc lesson, so I'm only going to take like 30 seconds to do this. But if instead of flexible not taking anything, if it takes first and that equals 1, A, and then second and that equals B, and then third and that equals C. All right, so this is a function now that takes 3 arguments, first, second, third. And down here, instead of saying A, B, C, I'll say X, Y, and Z. X, Y, and Z. And I'll get rid of this, and we'll call it 2 times, like this. All right, so first, second, third. Inside of flexible now, it's going to print out its arguments, and I'll also do one more thing, which is console.log with an object, and that object is going to be the values of first, second, and third. So we'll just say first, second, and third. This is sort of a shorthand. What happens is that this first expands to a key with the name first and a value of whatever the argument first is. This expands to a key of second, whatever the value of second is, and this expands to a key of third with whatever third is. Let me show you what that looks like.
You're missing a period there. Console.log.
I am, thank you. Not a comma, period. Sorry, got to get my fingers in the right place on the home row. Okay, so now if I refresh this, I call it 3 times, okay? The first time it gets called, it has length of 0. This is the call on line 35. Okay, so on line 35 it gets called with no arguments, but it prints out first, second, and third as A, B, and C because I've set up them as default arguments right here, 1, 2, and 3. So if I don't pass anything, that's the value they will have. Now, on line 36, I call it with X, Y, and Z. And so when I call it with lines with X, Y, and Z, first is X, second is Y, and third is Z. And that makes sense because they all have values. They all have values. The problem is that if I want to pass in if I only want to pass in the middle arguments and not pass in the arguments on here, on x and on y, I'd have to do undefined like this and undefined.
Okay.
And what that will do, I believe, I think that this works correctly, is that when I refresh this, yeah, when the value comes in as undefined, okay, what happens is that because the value is undefined, first is now set to its default value.
Yeah.
And second actually had an argument passed in, so it gets y. And third gets its default value of c because it got passed with undefined. So sorry, long story short,
No, but that makes sense because it did have a default value, and what you were passing it was undefined.
yeah, which is the same thing you would get passed if you didn't call, if you called the function with no arguments, which is why that undefined trick works. It's not really a trick, it's totally designed to work that way. It's just that this is a fairly new feature. This came about 2 years ago. These are called named parameters, and they are a feature of modern JavaScript, which is defined as everything from ES version 6 or ECMAScript version 6 and ahead. So ECMAScript version 6 was sort of implemented and put into browsers in 2015. So since about 2015, these features have been available. Okay, and I'm going to talk about this more later with like why JavaScript is awesome now. But it is awesome and it keeps getting better, and this is one of the reasons why, is that new features like this are being put into the language to make it more ergonomic and more flexible and also more sensible. Riley, you had a question?
Yeah, you've been referring to these things that you're passing into the function as arguments.
Yep.
I'm used to hearing parameters.
Yes.
Those are synonyms, or?
So they are two sides of the same coin. So inside of a function, when you have a function, think about it like a box. So if you had a box here that accepts some things and then outputs some things. So maybe it accepts some things, and we'll call those things A and B and C. Okay? From out here, they're called arguments. But inside the function where you use them, A and B and C, they're called parameters. And I'm being pedantic when I do this, parameters. Yeah. So they're called parameters inside the function. It is just to distinguish whether you are the caller, meaning the program outside the function, or the callee, the thing that is actually called. Are you inside the function or are you outside the function? So when you're outside the function, you pass arguments to a function. And when you're inside the function, you receive parameters from the outside world. Because you can think about a function as sort of its own little mini program that also gets to see outside of itself. But nothing gets to see inside of a function. So it's sort of like a little mini black hole. Like black holes can see outside, but nothing can see inside black holes. Okay? I think of them that way.
Yeah,
it helps me.
That was a good explanation. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Any other questions about that I can answer? I want to take a break in 3 minutes. So I want to make sure that I answer any more questions. We'll take a break for 15 minutes. We'll come back around 8, and we're going to talk about, I might give another short demonstration on doing like stepping debugging with the browser, which can be really helpful for this upcoming project. Because now the Markdown project is not a command line application like you've been used to writing. It's a JavaScript application that's going to run in the browser. So for that, I want you to have all the tools you need to be able to debug the browser and not get stuck, because it can be frustrating dealing with the browser and JavaScript and HTML all at the same time. Okay? So I'll come back and we'll talk about that. Any other questions about how this works before we move forward to that? Or events or event handlers?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The event listener is what passed the target or whatever. That's why you wrote event. Circling back to my original question about when you put event and say magic word. So when you had that blank and when you put event in there, something was passing it, an argument, was that the event?
What is it that's passing it? That's a good question.
Yeah.
So the thing that's passing it is that you have to remember that in this browser that you're using here, the browser is not programmed in JavaScript. The browser is programmed usually in a language like C++. And that's because browsers need to be fast and resource efficient. And so what's happening here is that when you interact with your browser, you're interacting with a C++ application, or a C application, or maybe a Rust application, which is another programming language that Mozilla writes part of Firefox in. The point is that it's not JavaScript. It's not JavaScript. Browsers have not been written in JavaScript to my knowledge. Okay? And the browser actually talks to your operating system on your computer to determine where it is you're clicking. Are you clicking inside of my browser window? Okay, you are. Cool. What part of my browser window are you clicking inside of? Oh, you're at X position 100 and Y position 200. It just so happens we have a button there. And you've now clicked on that button. So I am now going to trigger a browser event inside of the browser world. And that browser event is going to be an object that has a bunch of properties on it. And one of those properties is going to be the target that triggered that object. So what was the thing that was clicked upon or interacted with that generated that original event? And I'm going to pass that along as one of the properties in the event so that the person scripting this browser using JavaScript can properly handle that however they choose to do it. Okay, so it's a really good question, what is actually generating these events? And I think of it as like, there's like JavaScript has its world that it gets to live within, and then every once in a while there's like, you know, like in the Truman Show, there's like the speaker that comes on and sort of just like tells things to the world. Well, like JavaScript is like Truman, and the speaker comes on and tells Truman that he has to do things. And Truman does them. He doesn't really think about it because he's just always done it. So JavaScript gets to live in this world and get to be told when certain things have to happen. And one of the things that it gets told is when an event has occurred and what data that event has. It doesn't question where it came from, although it's really good that you as a programmer are questioning that. But JavaScript just receives the event from the browser and then chooses to either handle it or to not handle it. Does that make more sense?
Yeah.
Cool. Because it's two different things that are actually interacting. Your browser is interacting with the JavaScript that you as a programmer write. And then the browser itself is also interacting with the operating system. And the operating system might tell the browser to do certain things, or that certain things have happened. And the browser doesn't question where those commands have come from. It's just like, okay, you told me that when I click on the X in the upper left-hand corner of my window, I'm supposed to close. So I'm gonna close now. And then your operating system doesn't question when certain events happen from the hardware, or more specifically the BIOS, which is what's called the basic input-output system that lives underneath your operating system. And it's like, oh, I've gotten a shutdown event from the BIOS. The operating system, need to shut down now. And then your BIOS doesn't question when it gets an event from the hardware, like a power out event that says like, oh, the BIOS need to shut down. There's not going to be any more power coming in 10 microseconds. So I need to turn off all this equipment very quickly, right? And so it's sort of like one program on top of one another until they get to you, the human, who's actually interacting with your computer, right? So ultimately, you are the speaker that's telling the computer what to do. Maybe I took that metaphor too far. I don't know.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's a lot, but yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting how these all fit together.
Yeah, and it's a large layer, and nobody understands every single level of the layer.
Right.
There's nobody who's like, oh yeah, I understand every single level of the computer. Everybody has their layer that they're comfortable in, and they kind of work in that layer. And then it's just like nobody who's a contractor on a skyscraper knows every single part of the skyscraper, right? Because it's just too complicated. Even the architect understands the design. They don't understand the actual like implementation of the design. And so everybody has to play their part in order to get this giant thing to run well. Okay. So with that, why don't we take a break? It is 7:50, so let's come back at 8:05. And we will pick up from here. What we're going to do is do a little debugging, and then I'm going to spend some time talking about Markdown, and we're going to actually work on the project a little bit together to like get people acquainted with it, because there's a number of moving parts that I want to be able to have us practice before we try to take it and go home and do it on our own. All right. In the meantime, if you'd like, I'll paste the Markdown link for signing up for the classroom, the GitHub Classroom. You can follow that and sign up, and then grab the project out of GitHub Classroom with a git clone, and we can get you started when we come back. We're not going to start right into Markdown, but we're going to start in the second half of the class tonight working on Markdown. So I'll paste that link while you're all at break, and if you have any questions, let me know. All right? Let's see you at 8:05.